We are really fortunate to have joining us for this conversation today, John Denton. And I know John's going to be known to many of you on the live stream, but his current role as the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce has him very well placed to provide a perspective on the emerging global events and what we've described, if you like, as the 4 Ts: trade, tariffs, technology, and Trump. Now, in terms of the order of proceedings for the next hour or so, John's going to give some opening remarks. I've got a few pre-prepared questions that will get us going in the conversation, and then it's really over to you and the questions that you've got for John. As I said, have a look out for the pigeonhole details that will appear on your live stream window. You can click on that. The password is Global Matters. And without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome into our conversation John Denton. John, over to you, and perhaps let us know where in the world we find you today.
Well, good morning. I'm in Paris. The ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, we're based in Paris, but I'm actually on my way to London today, and I've actually just recently been in Washington and in New York. And prior to that, actually in Cape Town for the launch of the quite controversial this year G20, B20. I co-chair finance and infrastructure there. So I'll probably weave a little bit of that into our discussion today. First of all, let me thank CEDA. I'm a great fan of CEDA's. When I was in Australia, it was one of the kind of roundtables that focused on long-term economic development and economic opportunities, which was always needed, but also well operationalized by CEDA, I must say. And I know, Melinda, since you've been with CEDA, you've done a lot of work on economic analysis, but also forward thinking, which I think is interesting and useful. I know Australia is in the midst of an election campaign, and contributions of groups like CEDA, I think, to try and help the political class in particular, of course, focus on the day-to-day, but at the same time, in the context of some strategic opportunities for Australia is important. Just a little bit about the International Chamber of Commerce. So we are based in Paris. We were set up in 1918, 1919. We were kind of like the private sector analog to the League of Nations. The big difference is that we continue, whereas the League of Nations kind of disappeared. But I think mainly because we're a private sector organization and we're able to adapt and change, etc. We were set up by industrialists, actually, in the Northern Hemisphere in the ashes of the First World War, where they formed a view that where governments can't act to enable commerce to operate, then business need to step up. So they created the ICC as an independent, not-for-profit institution, and our aim was to enable cross-border trade, which becomes quite a sharp issue, but also cross-border trade in the context of enabling peace, because the hypothesis was always the more people traded together and economically integrated, the costs of war were actually higher, and so therefore would become a break in a way to that. I mean, we have established over the years a lot of the rules that enable business to function. You might be interested in a couple of data points. So we enable effectively through the ICC self-regulatory and codes and soft law capacity more than $17.5 trillion worth of economic activity every year. Without us, for example, the whole of the trade finance market could not function. So that's a $10 trillion market. We also enable we set up the concept of private arbitration, when we formed a view that the lack of access to independent arbitration for business was a drag on business operating across borders. So we took the concept of public arbitration, made it private. We now have the #1 court of arbitration in the world. We take about $380 billion worth of disputes, which we resolve peacefully through the Court of Arbitration. Since I took over, I've spread the ICC now into 170 countries. And importantly, 70% is in the global south. And I've done that for a particular purpose, because what I saw was a gap emerging in the ability to bring an inclusive global business voice to global policy framework settings. And so we have quite an extensive network. And it also means that our interests range from, I think, pure just getting business done to actually development issues. So, for example, this year I'm co-chairing the Finance for Development Conference for the UN. So that's a bit of a picture of the ICC. Interestingly, in this context of the 4Ts, we are actually a functioning multilateral platform. We're one of the few that actually function in the world. I can have ICC USA sitting at the same table as ICC Iran. Actually have ICC Syria right now sitting at the same table as ICC Israel. So we are united in an enabling purpose, which is to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. So just turning to, I suppose, the context of today's discussion, we see the emergence of the new US administration, I suppose, in pretty disruptive context. There is no doubt, looking at it, there are three key dimensions that are being disrupted. The first is the security dimension, and we can talk a little bit about that maybe in Q&A. If you think about the whole concept of multilateralism, allied-based frameworks, the new emergence of nuclear proliferation, as I was saying to you earlier, as almost a kind of normalized conversation compared to non-proliferation. So that security dimension has certainly been disrupted, and we can talk about why, if you'd like, later on. Importantly, the economic dimension is being disrupted. You look at it in terms of the functioning of the financial markets, but importantly, for the purpose of this conversation, what it means for trade and actually for development. And of course, people forget that trade and development are also linked together. And the third dimension, which has been disrupted, is actually around climate and around the energy transition. So they're the three key dimensions. Of course, there are lots of other things that are going on. I mean, as a former senior partner of a law firm, I don't think many of you would have missed what's happening with the razor-like focus on prestige law firms in the US. So there are actually lots of other issues that are running around at the same time. But they're the three key dimensions that we look at relate around security, economics, and the transition, the energy transition, because these really do ultimately matter to business. I'm just zeroing in on trade. April 2nd marks what's called Liberation Day, which is the day on which the administration will announce what's called reciprocal tariffs. The actual dimensions of that, or the elements of that, are still unknown. We know that it's more than just tariffs. We know that it's going to include non-tariff barriers. We know it's going to include consideration of foreign currency exchange and other issues as well. How they're pulling that together is quite meticulous, but the way in which they're going to shape that and form that and display that is actually not clear. You would have seen talk of the Dirty 15. There's a question whether that's Dirty 15 as in 15 countries or 15%. There's still a lack of clarity on that. And we know that the administration has already used tariffs in two ways. First of all, as a political economic tool, and the second actually as part of an industrial tool. And you would have seen the best example of the former is the kind of whipsaw placing of tariffs on Colombia, and then the withdrawal in 24 hours, because no one could have argued that was actually industrial, in the sense that there was no industry that they actually wanted to relocate to the US. So we've seen that. We've seen lots of tariffs announced. We've seen some withdraw. So there's still a level of uncertainty. And as many of you would know, there's also a challenge as to the practicability of application. One of the tariff measures that was put in place on China quite early on was the removal of what was called de minimis, which really said that anything under $800 would actually not attract a tariff. Would actually suddenly attract a tariff, which was seen as designed to hit the fast fashion retailers and their advent into the US. And then they discovered that they actually didn't have the means to apply that. So they withdrew that, because the practicality of that's quite complicated. And if you look at the practicality of what's been considered on the reciprocal tariffs, you're actually looking at potentially $2.6 million worth of trade lines that need to be examined. And there is, even with the genius of Doge, and even with the genius of the US administrative mechanisms, their ability to do that is actually questionable. So there will be quite a challenge from the date of announcement. We will see, no doubt, some changes and some recalibrations. So anyway, what we're seeing here is potentially quite disruptive. I don't think anyone in Australia would challenge that. But what's been interesting, though, is to try and put this in some perspective. A couple of facts. First of all, the US accounts for only 13%, that's 13% of global trade. 2 decades ago, it was more than 20%. The reason that's relevant is that the rest of the world, the 87%, is content to operate under the enabling global multilateral trade rules that we have. And that's not to say that those rules and the system is 100% pure and effective, but people are prepared to work under that. With 13%, you cannot of yourself enable a global trade war. So let's be clear about that. The most important drivers of global trade is not the US, but is actually the European Union and China, okay? And there is no indication whatsoever that the European Union is anything other than determined to maintain, and frankly, for its own political economy purposes, a functioning multilateral trading system. And as you would know, it's actually in the interests of China to maintain that system as well. So in this context of the 13% trying to dictate the potential disruption of the global trading system, that will only happen if its actions are reciprocated by the other trading partners. And then let's look at it in context as well. The actual quality of trade between US and China amounts to something like 1.8 to 2% of global trade. So even in that trading relationship, the pushes and shoves may not of itself result in the kind of return to the 1930s spectre, which everyone has at the back of their mind, that this is all going to hell in a basket. So it doesn't actually have to happen. The reason this becomes relevant is that when I describe the ICC as enabling $17.5 trillion worth of economic activity, friends, we're not an observer, we're actually an active participant here. We are firm believers in the power of enabling trade across borders to actually enable economic development. We've done the hard yards on economic analysis. This shows that the further erosion of the system is actually not cost-free. It actually has significant impacts. And the reason I was in South Africa, for example, was that the biggest losers out of the further erosion of the system is Africa. Frankly, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In Africa, erosion of the system will lead to a 40% downturn in trade flows. Similarly, in South Asia, 25 to 30% in Latin America. The point of all this as context is that what I'm arguing is that it's in the interests of the rest of the world, and in particular for the leadership of the Global South, to actively participate in what we're calling a coalition to revitalize the global trading system. So we want to use this opportunity of disruption to refocus everyone's minds on the need to have a functioning, effective 21st century multilateral trading system. And frankly, we're having some success. Most recently, ASEAN has taken forward a paper, and ASEAN sees the collapse of this system as an existential crisis because it will see in its own numbers an 11% drop in GDP across ASEAN. Now, that actually has direct implications for Australia, as you can imagine. So they are now part of what we're calling this coalition to revitalise the system. We're not talking about reforming the WTO. That's kind of like a dead argument. This is really about getting vitalisation back into the system and enabling it to be relevant. And the reason I'm very keen to speak in this forum today is that I actually think Australia has a role to play. Australia's behaved extremely responsibly in its response to the first tranche of tariffs on steel and aluminium, as has the UK, by the way, by not responding, not retaliating, because retaliation will only lead to economic self-harm. That's the problem that Canada has, and that's a particular issue they have, and if you want, we can talk about the specifics of their political economy around that. And also, that's one of the problems that Europe will have with retaliation as well. And actually, it's a problem that needs to be addressed in a positive way by looking for new markets under the existing system, which is exactly what Australia did in the first tranche of the interruptions caused to the trading relationship with China, where it used the system to find alternate markets. So we see a role for Australia in a leadership opportunity here. If you think about the importance of Australia's geopolitical position, having a strong Asia Pac as a neighbourhood means we should be aligned with the issues that really worry our neighbours. This is an existential issue for ASEAN. And so it's really important for Australia to be as involved in trying to come up with solutions. And the solution we see is not to stand back, paralysed by the disruption, put it in the context I've just put it in, and certainly work to revitalise the system. And by the way, revitalising the system is not anti-American, because what we're trying to do is create a system which is attractive for the Americans to rejoin fully. And let's be clear, US business does not want the multilateral system to collapse. People do not fully understand sometimes in Washington the way in which business is formed. Most significant US companies have subsidiaries operating out of Asia, Europe, Latin America. They don't want the economies in which those subsidiaries operating or their investments operating to collapse as well. So while they may be quiet at the moment, the interest that we're serving is the interests of global business. So hopefully that gives some perspective, Melinda, and happy to engage in any questions. But I do think Australia, and I know there's an election on, but I do think from a bipartisan point of view, and this is not an election for bipartisanship, I'm sure, people have to start realising that Australia does have an interest in revitalising this system, and the interests are also well served for its neighbours and our broader economic long-term engagement.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think Australia's been such a good, for want of a better term, the sort of honest broker in so many of these multilateral institutions for so long because of the benefits to us, honestly. But this will be a test of that, and we know through various crises that there's been challenges that have impacted our Asian trading partners in particular, and there's been at different times pushes and pulls to get different institutions up and running. Maybe we'll see what happens. But before we go on to that, John, I think one of the things, you're in a unique position to sort of understand what's happening in the rest of the world, but also to sort of translate that, if you like, to the Australian experience. And I think one of the things on everyone's minds here is, how business and how Australian businesses might think about responding to this sort of tariff environment when it's changing so quickly. As you said in your opening comments, not a lot of certainty or specificity about what some of this actually means in practice, and is it able to be implemented. So I'm just interested in how you think Australian organisations and businesses should be managing this uncertainty, and what you're seeing from your members in terms of how they're responding.
Well, to be frank, it might sound, I don't want to sound benign. Actually, funnily enough, I was giving an interview to Bloomberg on Friday, and they were saying, your language isn't passionate enough. I said, my language gets passionate when we talk about a global trade war. At the moment, I'm just objective and analytical. And it's very important to understand the nature of what's really going on. At the moment, everyone's jumping at a shadow here. So it's really important to understand with some specificity what is going to be applied. And I know that's hard. Obviously, larger organizations have capability to do this. And frankly, I must say, one of the things that's been impressive to me, I was not from the world of I suppose, business organizations. What's been impressive for me, we're actually about to hold a major conference in Kenya, in Nairobi, in about 2 weeks' time. The role of the chambers of commerce in Africa in helping unpick the complexity for the participants in those chambers is actually incredibly important. And one of our jobs is to ensure that they're as well informed as possible, but importantly, given a strategic dimension. And again, not observers, they're actually actors in this. So understanding what's going on, continuing to scale it. Most large companies generally have, the term is probably terrible, war rooms looking at this anyway. I've just been with, for example, Rio Tinto in London. Obviously, they're looking at this specifically. They have a team set up. So we see a lot of that going on. but also understanding that from an Australian point of view, the actual quality of the trading relationship with the US, whilst it's very important, it is not it is not the only market in the world. The reality is, as Australian business found with China, lots of other market opportunities will open up here. One of the things that I think businesses are doing very well in Australia is constantly scanning the global environment to find opportunities. And that should continue. But I also know that a number of the chambers are actively involved in trying to support. And also the bilateral chambers can be quite useful in this as well, like the US-Australia chamber. So, but they're kind of very specific. I don't know if they're even particularly helpful. This is basically trying to understand the risk, measure it, build the capability to support it, but trying to get a little bit ahead of it all. And a lot of people are doing that.
And not overreact to sort of the first round.
Well, I mean, there's a natural kind of, you look at just simple behavioral economics. People are, you look at the forward inventory book in the US, it's diminished. But you look at last month, everyone thought there was a bump. That's because everyone was stocking up.
Yeah.
And so looking forward is quite complicated. And also and this is one of the problems with the stop-start nature and the lack of clarity, is it's leading to uncertainty. And what it's also saying to businesses is hold off, just wait.
Yeah.
But I think one of the issues is where CEDA can be very helpful is, and I'm seeing this is something we've argued in Europe and also in Canada as well. This is also an opportunity because it provides a leverage point to argue the case for domestic or microeconomic reform.
Yeah.
I mean, we're using that term. That's always frightening to a lot of punters because they think it's going to mean they're going to lose their jobs. But this is an opportunity, for example, in Canada, to remove a lot of the barriers to cross-province trade, stuff that Australia did in the 80s and the 90s. And in Europe, Mario Draghi, and we do a lot of, I'm doing a big piece in Rome at the end of this week. Mario, it's funny how in Europe, they always turn to the Italians for economic competitiveness advice. You might find that interesting. So Draghi and Letta, both of whom I've got the pleasure of getting to know, they're both arguing, you're worrying about tariffs from the US. Look at the tariffs we put on ourselves, which is why, by the way, I say the European Union is still a cross-border trade excess work in progress.
Yeah.
There's actually still a lot of opportunity. I think for Australia as well, this is a leverage point for economic reform, but also looking at how you enable small businesses much more effectively to function. You can put it in a very positive light.
Well, I'll come back and tell you about our agenda on that front, but I've got questions just pouring in as I knew I would, John. So let me jump to one of those. Straight out of the gate, not surprisingly, interest in what the fragmentation of US-China trade may or may not mean for Australia and the openings that might create, the challenges that might create. And it sort of segues into a broader question that we had for you, John, around how Australia might recalibrate its sort of relationships with the US and China. So what thoughts there?
Well, I mean, let's put it in another perspective. I mean, both major global economies are involved in some pretty big bets at the moment, aren't they? If you look at it, most economists are arguing against the actual course of action that the US administration is taking, particularly in tariffs. But there is a very big bet there going on because it's about a broader geopolitical issue. I'll come back to what that is in a second. And in China, there's actually a huge gamble being played effectively with macroeconomic settings as Xi seeks to wrestle the country into this techno-industrial transformation he's working on. And they're prepared to suck up a lot of macroeconomic damage to do that. The big bet they're taking is that they're able to successfully enable this sort of techno-industrial transformation where they've had some success, particularly in EVs, that will actually have quite a transformational effect on the economy. But what that tells you is the geopolitical context is really about one thing, which is economic superiority in the 21st century. That's what these two big bets are about. You can put it in crass domestic political terms about avoidance about anti-China or anti-American, etc. But ultimately, that's what it's about. And the competition is leading to these big bets. What is really interesting, just from a geostrategic application, is the very measured approach at the moment that China is taking in response to the US interventions and statements about what it will do, and also some of the interventions that have already been put in place. So the idea that there's going to be some kind of easy recalibration of that relationship whilst this competition is on foot, I think is naive. However, there are common interests. There is still, going to one of the other dimension, there is still a common interest about action on climate, even though the way the Trump administration talks about it, it's as though that doesn't matter. But the issue of energy transition, we talked about in different ways, there are common interests there. There are also common interests in avoiding nuclear proliferation. There is no doubt about it that there is a common interest there. So there are, and again, in all these things, there's an interest in how that can be developed. More worrying is some of the analytical frameworks that are being placed on this current activity. Is the actual new US administration disposition towards what's called spheres of influence, and effectively for the US, it's about the sphere of influence in the north and the Americas. They leave Russia with a sphere of influence through Europe, and China gets Asia. I don't think that's in anyone's interests.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a strange kind of 18th century, 19th century application of great power politics. But there are risks in all of this for Australia, which is why I go back to the point about what's in the interests of our neighbours. Our interests of our neighbours are their economic sustainability, and obviously a security umbrella around that, which is very important as well. And so working on that, I mean, there's going to be a major challenge for Australia if you actually take the view that the US is effectively asking people now to pay for its security support. That's quite a fundamental shift from the 1950s and even the establishment of NATO, which was seen not just as a public good, but actually seen as in the US interest to ensure that Europe remained stable. This is quite a different mercantilist view. And if that's the case, how does Australia actually balance that with its economic situation now? How does it re-weight itself towards much greater expenditure on its defence and forward reach? So there's big issues that come out of this.
Well, I'm gonna come back to the sort of climate issue, but let's just segue into this topic just for a minute, because there's a question here around kind of the US ceding its soft power, right? You know, through so much of the influence that it had through aid, through these multilateral organizations. You talked before about the regions that stand to lose the most from this. And let's just talk about Africa as a for instance. That's also one of the regions where we're going to see the strongest population growth in the next generation. So you've got this mix of potential significant economic harm. You've got the winding back of the levers of soft power through aid, and then really strong population growth, which is going to be difficult to manage in terms of expectations for an emerging younger population. How do you see those issues sort of being squared, and how is the world going to sort of respond to this? And do you see anyone sort of stepping in where the US is sort of vacating the space?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, obviously there was a moment of unipolarity after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and then we moved to a bipolar world. Where we are at the moment is multipolarity. There's no doubt about it. I'm not trying to use kind of buzzwords, but that's where you're actually seeing different leadership coming from different regions. Multipolarity can be managed when there's strong multilateralism. Without multilateralism underpinning it, you end up with fragmentation. And that's actually the real risk we're seeing right now. One of the interesting observations, I hope your listeners or participants will see this as well, is that the world is very different in 2025 than it was at the beginning of the first Trump administration, and certainly at the end of the first Trump administration. Just a couple of things. We've seen the emergence of the BRICS Plus group, which I know in Australia is actually kind of vaguely dismissed, because I've seen some of these, I've been involved in some of these discussions, with policymakers, but this is actually a serious group. It doesn't have a unifying political purpose. Of course, some of the proponents want its political purpose to be anti-American and anti-Western values, but that's not the way the UAE sees it. That's not the way Brazil sees it. There's actually an opening in the BRICS Plus group. In fact, we're working with the BRICS Plus group now because a number of the participants want to have market settings and open markets. They actually see it as an economic opportunity. So there is actually the emergence of new groupings. The other thing that I find interesting that the US from time to time has not really engaged with is when I talked about the US now only being 13% of global trade, they actually missed a little bit. Well, I shouldn't say they missed it. They're discounting the increase in South-South trade and also the importance of that. So what you're seeing in Africa is an opportunity, which you correctly point out, which is a demographic opportunity, but also that's where a lot of the economic growth will come. They've actually put in place the African Continental Free Trade Area. We work with, that's based in Accra. We work with the Secretariat there to try and give birth to, I think, the opportunity, the reality of, or to try and deliver on the opportunity of that. There is no doubt with the diminution of US engagement through development assistance that the capacity of the US to project that soft power will be diminished. But I wouldn't write it off. I mean, I think there's a danger here. The development assistance budget of the US, whilst it was very significant in global terms, was actually not particularly significant in global economic terms. Of course, most Americans think they were giving like $1 trillion. In fact, they were giving 800 billion. It's like most Australians think we give a lot more in development assistance than we do. In fact, we have one of the lowest development assistance budgets of any OECD country, I might point out, which is kind of interesting. But we've also seen the diminution of the UK. They've actually just integrated or lessened their budget so they can flip it to defence. The Germans have just announced the same thing. The Dutch have done the same thing. The Swiss are about to do the same thing. The French have done the same. So there is a shift away from development assistance. Of course, what that does and what it does for an organisation like the ICC is we don't rely on anyone's money. We generate our own. Is that we're doubling down on creating enabling environments for economic development in Africa and elsewhere. That's why I'm co-chairing this Finance for Development conference for the UN this year. It's how do you create enabling environments to allow the trillions of dollars worth of private capital, which is potentially available, to find a home in commercially responsible return investments, but also participation. How do you change some of the macroprudential regulations, regulatory frameworks that make it so hard to invest in developing and emerging economies? There's a whole lot of things that need to go on. And by the way, I have common cause. When I was in Washington, I was meeting the chair of the House Committee for Finance, which actually oversees Treasury, etc., Republican. And we have common cause on issues like changing the macroprudential regulatory frameworks to enable more investment to take place in developing and emerging economies. Soft power will come, not necessarily from development assistance moving forward, but from strong, responsible investment in these economies and working to help develop them. The US has a role in that. Australia has a role in that. The OECD actually has a helpful role to play in that as well, which is led by another Australian in Paris, Matthias.
You talked about free trade in Africa, and I think we've talked about, the desire to make sure that trade keeps flowing in ASEAN and in our neighbourhood. Are you seeing a greater, and this is again a question from the audience, are you seeing a greater appetite for bilateral free trade agreements? Are you envisaging a world that's going to accelerate that, move towards regional trade agreements, or do you think we have to reconfigure the multilateral organisations?
Well, the multilateral system will continue to function. The issue is effective in its functioning. So that's there. So the opportunity we have is to revitalise it. The reason you see a number of regional and bilateral agreements is because the system itself, which underpins the multilateral system, hasn't been updated properly since it came into existence in 2020, which is why it doesn't, for example, cover the digital economy. It's just a classic because it came into place before the internet, just as the internet was going into the public domain and before payment systems were linked up to the internet. So the whole e-commerce revolution, which has revolutionized the global economy, is actually not covered by the rules of the multilateral system, and certainly can't be governed by the WTO. So that just shows a deficiency in the system, which is why it needs to be revitalized. But let's not forget, we actually have already entities like the Comprehensive Partnership for Trans-Pacific, CPTPP, which is one of the largest and most, I think, by the way, these are all WTO compliant. I'm just about to mention now. So that entity, which is a very, I think, modern and effective agreement. And of course, one of the issues there is accession, to have more economies there, because we all know that the US was part of founding the original TPP, but was unable to translate that into an outcome. But Australia, Japan, and others went on and did that. We've also got the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is one of the largest trade agreements in the world. That interestingly brings together China, Japan, and Korea. Its co-chair at the moment is Japan and Indonesia. We have the ASEAN Plus process. We also have Mercosur. You've seen the EU-Mercosur agreement come into place. We're still waiting for the French to get out of the way so it can be effective. We're actually seeing the reopening of the EU-ASEAN agreement, which is something we've been encouraging as well. These are all WTO compliant, or these are all sort of compliant and aligned with the system itself. So we do see this context continuing to evolve into more regional agreements. That's not a bad thing itself. And I just mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area as well. So these are continuing to focus on the ability to trade across borders. And that's a really important dimension. Trying to capture that then and revitalize the global system is one of the challenges we have. And building in more flexibility is key here, because without that, that's what's given birth to the bilaterals and the regional. But of themselves, they're not a problem from our perspective.
I think a lot of interest in the energy transition piece from our audience as well, and thinking about cross-border movements and taxes. The question that's popped up here is around, well, one, interested in your views on what the impacts of all this are for the energy transition and decarbonisation. But the specific question as well is will recent or forthcoming trade measures undermine the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and how you're seeing that, and what might the US response be in all of that?
Well, let's not forget, maybe I'll deal with the latter part of that. Let's not forget that the US response is not just US central driven. Let's not forget the role of states in this. What's interesting, when I was in Washington meeting with Democrats, because being in Washington, you carefully have to meet on both sides of the aisle and ensure everyone knows you are. But with the Democrats, what's interesting, I also met with the regional governors. There's actually talk of linking up California, Illinois, New York, all Democrat states with the European CBAM. So there's actually not talk of walking away from it. There's talk of how you actually enable it. The problem with, well, there's lots of problems with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but in essence, it's not problematic, because ultimately it's about how do you stop carbon leakage. It's the way in which the Europeans have devised the process, which makes it unworkable from an economic engagement point of view with developing and emerging trading blocks or trading regions. So there's a real problem in enabling access to that market through the CBAM mechanisms for Latin America. I do a lot of work in Brazil. That's a particular issue they have, as does other Latin American countries. And obviously, this has been the poisonous source of the discontent between Indonesia and Europe as well. What we're seeing now, and what we've always argued for, is actually some realistic settings, but also much deeper engagement by the Europeans with the developing, emerging, and other economies about the mechanisms, how they can make it work, but also building the capability so it can work. There's a lot more openness to that. I don't know if you picked up, but there's a lot more openness in Europe to joining up the environment and the geopolitical sides of Europe's interests now. That anyone who's been to Brussels probably would have seen in the principal building that there's not just a silo, there's like a Cold War between the trade side and the environment side, and the environment side effectively dominated. But now, of course, that's being shifted. So there's a lot more realism which is emerging in the application of what's called the Green New Deal and all its contours.
Follow-up question, when we think about what we leverage and the new sort of geopolitical realities of all of these transitions, is whether we should be doing more to leverage our rare earths supply as a negotiating tool with the US. Having recently glanced at some media coverage of the deal that the US is extracting from the Ukraine, I'm not sure how we feel we would go on that.
Actually, I was just on Friday. I was on a call with the deputy economics minister of Ukraine, because we actually keep the private sector functioning in Ukraine. By the way, I've had the honour of being welcomed 3 times since the war started there, so we're quite involved. And he was giving me the contours or the details of the agreement. I think it sounds to me like an agreement that can be rejected or resisted in all its elements.
Well, should we be going down that path of negotiating around rare earths?
Well, I mean, but the reality, going back to the original context, we sort of put the dimensions, these security disruptions on the economy, disruptions. Well, the bit that's shifted a bit when I started talking about spheres of influence is the movement away from rules-based to power-based politics. And in part, of course, everything is about leverage, and leverage comes to what do you have? And of course, the world is not static. At the moment, there's a lot of leverage around critical minerals. So clearly, in negotiation with a power-based player, getting leverage is critical. And the other thing is Australia is a huge source of potential capital for investment in the US, which is the joy of just the reality that the fastest growing pool of capital in the world is actually in Lonsdale Street, which is in the pension fund system. And clearly, when you look at the super sessions that Kevin ran or enabled with Heather Ridout in Washington and like Kath Botel from IFM and others, that's a pretty clear marker to the US of the importance of Australia as a source of capital. That's potentially, you would say, economic statecraft at its best.
Yeah. I'm going to ask the question. I had a question in mind, and now something else has jumped up. Actually, it's just racking up votes as I speak. So I'm going to show my agility here, John. Having talked about that, we've gone straight to AUKUS. And the question from Dan, who's watching, is how do you think the change in alignment of defence guarantees and arrangements is going to impact AUKUS? And what does this mean for us in terms of military procurement, defence spend, all the rest of that?
Well, I mean, I hope I didn't say it in passing, but one of the challenges that any economy and any sovereign nation finds in an environment where the global security arrangements are being disrupted is how does it reposition itself effectively, not just for the here and now, with that as a long-term challenge. I mean, that's clearly now needs to be factored in to Australian strategic planning. The fact that, yes, we have a treaty, yes, we have an alliance, yes, we have an ally, but also the expectations in terms of burden sharing have shifted. And there is no doubt that if you look at the driving forces, which are the realpolitik of the new US administration, and you can rail about it all you like, but this is actually in a way not new. This has been a constant theme of American policy. It's not the only theme, but now it's the dominant theme, which is about burden sharing and the need to, and this plays out in trade, plays out in economic, plays out in development assistance, plays out in climate, plays out in security as well. Entities, basically sovereign states around the world need to recognize this and think therefore about how do they provide for their own futures, what does that look like? And clearly AUKUS is one dimension of that. It's also, in a sense, if I could, and I wouldn't describe myself as a defense materiel expert, it's not static. I mean, having been in Ukraine 3 times in the last 6 months, one thing you note now is that most battles there are fought by drones. that is actually not how their systems were set up militarily. They've had to recalibrate themselves quite dramatically. The reason I say that is that the war or the defense that we must be preparing ourselves to have is actually not necessarily what's right for us now. Are we developing? Do we have the innovation? Do we have this? Do we have the intellectual capacity? And do we have the national will to do that? And I think it's a really interesting issue, which is really, how do we ensure that Australia has the enabling environment for the innovation that will be required, not just for defence, but also the energy transition, etc. Are we investing enough in research? Are we investing enough in universities? Are we building the human capability? Are we bringing in the best people, or enabling the best people to stay? Are the capital markets aligned to this? There's a lot of, I think for me, this is where I think CEDA should play to its strengths. But for me, as someone who's involved in things like the Australia and the Asian Century White Paper, it's what Australia does best. It's a long-term consideration of the best interests of the nation, not just for today, but for the next 20 years.
John, you're doing such a good plug for our Progress 2050 agenda, which goes to this. And I think, but in all honesty, I think some really important messages here. You talk about drones. I think it's really important that we start thinking about the different complexion of what the defence industry is these days, and how we're thinking about innovation, and how we're thinking about leveraging innovation across all of the things that you spoke to in terms of energy transition and a whole range of challenges that we've got before us. I knew we were going to race through time, but I do want to get to this question, which you sort of put a pin in at the beginning in your comments around Canada. And the reason I'd really like to get to it is because I think it goes to, in some ways, how we've got to where we are, and a real challenge for how we try to avoid the worst of where we are, which is the populist sort of kind of reaction around globalization and who's benefited from it. Economists know what the economic impact of tariffs is, and it's not good, and it's usually not good for low-income households, as for instance. And particularly,
why don't I challenge one of the nostrums here? Look, I know that there's a very easy discussion which takes place about the end of globalization. I think it's really important to understand what globalization is, and the challenges are actually before us. There is no doubt that globalization will continue. It's just that it's going to look different.
Yeah.
What's important to understand, there's two-track globalization. And that's where the national security and security issues are intervening. And of course, you talk about public opinion as well. On that issue, critical minerals, all this sort of stuff, there is absolutely no doubt right now that there's an interference in globalization of a lot of what's seen as national security aligned economic activities. It's just going on. But that only accounts for about 20% of global trade anyway. The rest of the global trade will continue to globalize. There is nothing as strong as the iron rule of economics around comparative advantage.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just what's happening. And even on the national security dimension, we talk about critical minerals now because it's a here and now issue. National security interests change over time. And also to protect the particular industries and sectors which are covered by national security interests costs a lot of money. And the issue is really over a long period of time, when people believe they've now got that nailed and they're moving on somewhere else, does that move back into a comparative advantage discussion as well? It's really important, I think, to understand that the globalization will change, but it's not dead.
Yeah.
The issue is, what does it look like, and how do we best govern it to ensure that populations get the best outcome from it? Can I just say on the populist issue, of course, this is a direct, I think, observation about US public policy, and I've made it in the US, so I wouldn't shy away from it here. US has a number of public policy choices when actually we moved into this next iteration, the last iteration of globalization. Countries like Australia and Europe and lots of others invest in a lot of public goods to do with education, social safety nets, etc. The US politically, and this is perfectly understandable, chose not to. They did not make some of the public policy choices which would have actually enabled, I think, some of the transition which was more effectively handled in other countries. I'm not criticizing them, I'm just making a point. I think we can actually show from a very analytical point of view the choices they made. People blame trade, but as you know, most of the change occurred because of technological innovation.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges, one of the big bets that they're making going to this gamble, which is the industrialization of the US, what does it actually look like? The actual costs of actually rearranging supply chains and actually import substitution is a lot higher than people think. And frankly, it's a lot slower than people think. The economic incentives for business are very different to the political incentives of governments. In business incentives for business and timelines a lot longer than 4-year or 2-year political cycles.
And so where do you think, where do you see Canada, the bind that Canada's in? I mean, they've got, some big impacts coming from a big country to their south, a lot of political rhetoric as well. They've been pretty strong and talking about retaliation and all the rest of it. We know that that's, you spoke to this earlier, it's sort of the race to the bottom. But where do you see how their response to all this and what the impacts will be?
Well, first of all, I mean, maybe look at the reality that what you're seeing is the erosion of the North American trading system. So that's the first thing. I feel we shouldn't ignore Mexico in all of this as well.
Yeah, indeed.
The point is that Mexico has a lot more to negotiate with in a way than Canada does. If you take the first tranche of Trump tariffs, they're around fentanyl and around illegal immigration. The amount of fentanyl that crossed the border from Canada could fit in my backpack. And I'm sorry, I've never done that, by the way. Actually, for illegal immigration is actually a very small number. Whereas I think we all know that from Mexico across the border, the porous borders, it's a much bigger issue. So Canada actually has a lot less to negotiate. They have a lot less leverage. Mexico actually has a lot of leverage in this. If you look at it from a great power point of view. And I think anyone who's observing this would say, Sheinbaum, who was actually not a particularly popular leader for many people, is now extremely popular, by the way, which she's seen to have played the leverage. They're yet to actually announce their retaliation. They're still in that process, by the way. The Canadians have a much different challenge. As I said, they've got very little leverage on it. The reality, as their own central bank governor has said, if they retaliate, they're going to tip themselves into recession. Nothing is going to happen of substance during the election campaign. Ultimately, the economic integration that's already taken place will take generations to unwind. That's in nobody's interests. And the broader issue is Canada has, and this is something people haven't noticed, been seeking over the last 10 years to actually diversify its markets, okay? But it's pretty hard when you have a market like the US right on your doorstep, effectively, to actually walk away from that market opportunity. But they have spent more time. The other thing that Canada has not done, and this is something that Australia did do, and I think did extremely well, was around state-based economic reform in terms of cross-border. They haven't done that. They haven't done that. And now that's actually providing a propulsion to do that as well. Ultimately, Canada will not be able to engender a trade bloc with the European Union, UK. I mean, a lot of people speculated that the Carney's first visit was to London, France, and to Brussels, I think it was. And the idea was that he was going to get some retaliatory. He would say he did not, and I'm sure he didn't. But the reality is, even if he wanted to, he couldn't do it. That's not going to happen. So they're going to have to work out how this arrangement can prosper post the election. And that'll be in a couple of weeks, actually.
Well, we're watching that with interest, not least because we managed to have Mark Carney on our stage not long ago, obviously in a very different capacity, but it's created a bit more interest.
Himself to be a bit of a retail politician. I mean, I'm not close to Mark, but I spent a bit of time with him. I don't think many people would have seen him as a retail politician. But I do think this is something will be at the Canada, by the way, is chairing the G7 this year. So I'm in Ottawa at the G7 B7 in about 2 months. Well, not that long. We're trying to encourage the Canadians to look at this issue of revitalising the trading system, because that's also in their interests as well.
Yeah. I was a participant in the Australia-Canadian Leadership Forum, and some of the issues that you spoke to as well around, domestic regulatory reform is definitely needs to be on the agenda. John, we've run out of time. I knew this was going to happen, but I also know that you've got to hop on a train, so you won't be too sad about that. Thank you so much for bringing your insights. We could have gone on for a lot longer. There's a lot of questions still pouring in. For the audience, know that you're going to receive a post-event email. You'll get a link to this conversation so you can listen to it again if you like, or share it, and it'll be available on the website as well. John was giving us some really nice kind of openers for me to say a brief word about our Progress 2050 agenda, which is a long-term agenda, very much in the spirit of many of the issues that John spoke to as being so important, for Australia's long-term future and prosperity around the competitiveness and dynamism of our businesses around the energy transition, but also just to pick up the point that John was making about the decisions that the US made, the importance of a really strong social compact, which has underpinned our brand of economic development in Australia and has enabled more ambitious reforms in times gone by, and I think something that we're very keen to continue to put a spotlight on. I know that we're all very obsessed with our own election here and elections everywhere, John, but for those of you who don't want to just follow every second of the election, we've of course got plenty going on at CEDA. Check out the website, ceda.com.au. In terms of upcoming events that you might be interested in, we've got an AI community forum, which is about enabling the adoption and use of trusted AI amongst our members and how we can use that to develop a competitive edge. We've got our ESG community forum as well. And then we've got another Global Matters event looking at work from home, productivity, and what it means for markets with Professor Nick Bloom, who's been on our stage before and really drawn a lot of interest from members. So plenty there to be interested in. Again, thank you, John. Travel safely, and good night to everyone here in Australia.